right. Hey everyone, I'm Vlad Sirkovich, and this is my brother Eugene Sirkovich.
Hi.
And we're going to be talking about OpenID today. The title of our talk is Single Sign-On for the Internet, a Security Story. And the agenda for today is basically to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're going to be talking about the good things about OpenID, sort of the good security things about it, the bad about OpenID, the security implications of using it, and the ugly problem it addresses. And so we're going to start off with the ugly problem it addresses.
Before we start, how many people know what OpenID is? Okay.
How many people actually have an OpenID?
Okay.
All right. So the ugly problem it addresses is basically managing, 40 or 60 user accounts on a bunch of random online websites. And the question is really, how do you manage all these accounts? If you're anything like me, your single sign-on solution basically consists of a single username, like Vlad Sirkovich, and two passwords. One for, one throwaway insecure password for like dig and /dot, and one actually secure password that I use for online banking or online communication. So show of hands, who actually uses this scheme? It's not as many of you as I expected, which is good. Or it means you're just putting, 40 unique passwords on your screen, or you just, instead of using two passwords, use only one. But the problem with using an approach like this is that a malicious website, to compromise a user, a malicious website only has to fail a user's login attempts. And they could pretty much just watch the user type in every single combination of username and password that he's ever used. And I know that personally, when I can't log into dig or /dot, I try every single possible username password combination I've probably ever used. So an attack like this would definitely succeed even against educated users. So our first piece of black hat advice is to change your bank password. We man in the middle of your secure single sign-on last night. And it also leads to our first observation, a common security mantra, but complexity breeds insecurity. And forcing a user, even an educated user, to remember 40 unique passwords for 40 different websites is just impossible. Even a unique user will just use either two passwords or will just, stick them all on his monitor. So it's definitely not possible to keep going with this approach. And this is where OpenID comes in. OpenID is a single sign-on system, so it greatly reduces the complexity of, managing a million user accounts. Instead, you have a single user account, you have a single password, and you use that all across the internet. So it greatly reduces the complexity of authentication. OpenID basically proves that a user owns a URL. So you get to choose an identity provider, and we'll be talking more about that later. And you basically prove that you are john.doe.name. It answers the who question, who are you? Are you john.doe.name? Are you vlad.sirkovich.myopenid.com? It doesn't answer the what question. It doesn't answer, whether I'm allowed to access a certain page or perform a certain function on a website. The actual website implementing OpenID has to implement that. So OpenID deals with authentication and not authorization. So a brief history of OpenID. OpenID was first sort of invented by Brad Fitzpatrick in 2005. Brad Fitzpatrick is fairly well known. He participates in LiveJournal. I think he was one of the creators.
Yeah.
And basically, he created this because if you, read a couple dozen blogs, and I know I do, every time you want to post a comment, a lot of times you have to have a unique username and password for every single one of these blogs. And, that if you, subscribe to 100 blogs, that's simply impossible to do. So he came up with OpenID so that you could only have a single username and password and use it across all these different blogs. The nice thing is that because it's used on the web, it could actually, instead of just being used for blogs, it could be used anywhere, including email, banking, whatever you want to do. So unsurprisingly, the first specification was titled OpenID 1.0, and since then there's been one more finalized specification, OpenID 1.1, which didn't significantly change the protocol. There's one more draft version out right now called OpenID 2.0, and it is significantly different from OpenID 1.1. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking about mostly about OpenID 1.1. So there's probably a dozen single sign-on systems out there. The nice thing about OpenID is that it's actually gaining a lot of mainstream acceptance. A lot of major players like Microsoft, AOL, Sun, they're all starting to back it. And the OpenID integration is actually one of the milestones for Firefox 3. Microsoft actually integrated its own single sign-on solution called CardSpace into OpenID so that you can use CardSpace within OpenID. AOL actually created 63 million new OpenID users when they gave every single AOL users an OpenID URL. So earlier when I asked if any of you had OpenIDs, only a couple of you raised your hands, but if you use AOL, and I mean, who of us doesn't, you actually already have an AOL OpenID. If you use LiveJournal, you already have an OpenID.
Yeah.
Include the AIM users? Does that include the AIM users?
I believe so, yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Microsoft, as I said, integrated CardSpace. Sun is providing OpenID URLs to all employees. The government of Estonia is planning to give every single citizen of Estonia, about 2 to 3 million people, an OpenID and a smart card to be used for online authentication. So it's definitely gaining a lot of support, and it's got a lot more support than other single sign-on solutions. So how does OpenID actually look to sort of the OpenID end user? And we've provided a demo here so that you can see what the end user interaction sort of looks like. And it's actually a man-in-the-middle secure demo because we've only provided screenshots. So this is an example login using OpenID. So here you go to an OpenID-enabled website. In this case, we've chosen jite.com, and you just put in your URL. Your URL can be whatever you want it to be, as long as it's a valid URL. And in this case, it's eugene.circlevich.name. And as you can see below in the examples, there's other possible OpenID URLs you can use, like u.myopenid.com, username.livejournal.com, first.last.name, whatever. So you put in your OpenID URL and you click sign in. And you're redirected from jite.com to myopenid.com. Myopenid.com in this case is eugene.circlevich.name's OpenID provider. And your OpenID provider is sort of your central place for your digital identity. They store all your information. They'll authenticate all your requests. So here you're redirected. Your username is already filled in for you. It's eugene.circlevich.name. And you're expected to fill in your password. And if you want to, you can click a little checkbox, stay signed in case you want to be signed in automatically whenever you go to another OpenID-enabled website. So you put in your password, you click sign in, and you go to the second screen. And the second screen is basically asking, do you want jite.com to be able to see your information? And this is in case, you go to bank.com and you log in and then you figure out that, bank.com is you're actually being phished and some weird website wants to know your information. You can click deny if you want to. The nice thing about OpenID is that you can also store personal information on the central server. So rather than just proving that you're john.doe.name, if you want the convenience of filling out sign-up forms for online banking automatically, this prompt can also ask you, do you want etrade.com to see your full name, your address, your social security number, and it'll greatly enhance the sign-up and login process. It'll be much, much more quick. So if you click allow forever or allow once, you'll be taken back to jite.com, and as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, you're automatically logged in as eugene.circlevich.name. So that process is actually fairly simple for an end user to understand. It's not a huge difference from the current process we're using. However, it seems fairly simple, but there's actually sort of a complex protocol behind it. So there are actually a number of major players sort of in the OpenID login process. First, there's the user actually logging in. So John Doe in the upper left-hand corner. That's you sitting at home with your laptop, browsing to whatever.com. Then there's the OpenID-enabled website. In our example, it was, jite.com. In OpenID parlance, it's called the relying party. Then there's your URL host. For example, if you put in, eugene.circlovich.name, whoever is hosting that URL is also another player in this. And then there's the identity provider. In our case, it was myopenid.com. So this is the part of the presentation where we start talking about the bad things about OpenID, sort of the security problems. And so let's start at the beginning. So after you put in your OpenID URL into the text box, and you click sign in, that OpenID-enabled website, such as jite.com, will download the information at that OpenID URL. And the reason it does that is because let's say you enter in, foobar.com/max. With that URL, the OpenID enabled website doesn't know what your identity provider is. There's nothing intrinsic in the URL that says what your identity provider is or what your username on that identity provider is. If you want, eugene.circlovich.name can be both your username and your URL, as it is in this case, but it doesn't have to be. So the reason it downloads this URL, or the information at that URL, is for these two HTML tags that you see in this display. It strips out this information. The first tag specifies your OpenID identity provider, that's openid.server. And the second tag specifies your username on that identity provider. So in this case, it's eugene.circlovich.name. So it downloads this so it can get the information about your identity provider and your username. However, there's a number of problems with this. URLs are fairly flexible, and a malicious user, if you wanted to, could go to an OpenID-enabled website and use it as a man in the middle to scan a remote host. There's nothing stopping a user from entering in a malicious URL like nsa.gov port 1, nsa.gov port 2, and continuing to do this forever to essentially scan that host. And because it's the relying party, because it's jite.com actually downloading this URL, if a security analyst at nsa.gov, looks at the packets flying by, he's going to think it's jite.com and not you. There's also a number of other things that you can do with malicious URLs. You can access internal resources that you wouldn't have access to otherwise because they're firewalled off. And you might be able to access privileged information, or you might be able to do some sort of nasty thing which you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with localhost. When you put in localhost, again, jite.com will download that URL, so it'll actually contact itself on the loopback interface. Now, if you try to port scan jite.com, from the outside behind the firewall, you might not be able to access anything other than maybe port 80 and port 443 for HTTP and secure HTTP. Thankfully, with OpenID's help, you can not only port scan them behind their firewall, you can port scan them on the loopback interface. A lot of times, services will run on ports that aren't accepting information from the entire network. They're only accepting information from localhost. So in actuality, by doing this, you'll have more access to the computer the server is running on than a computer on its local network would, which is behind the firewall with it. So that's very convenient for an attacker. Then, of course, you can cause a denial of service by causing jite.com to download, a huge YouTube movie file, or download, Debian install ISOs. it's pretty hard to filter out, all the malicious inputs that can be given to you that are, hundreds of megabytes large. And then again, no one is also saying that those tags, those link tags in the HTML page have to be, in the first kilobyte. They might be after that huge 100 megabyte, YouTube video. So in actuality, you can cause this OpenID enabled website to, download huge websites or to download huge files and essentially cause a denial of service. If it has bandwidth restrictions from the ISP, you can probably conk it offline permanently until they talk to their ISP again. You can also have it contact a host like just a tar pit host, where basically the web server will spawn a new thread and connect to this web server, and it'll ask for the information at CGI bin/hang.pl, but instead the web server will just hang, and it'll just take up a web server thread that's not doing anything. And a single web server thread isn't going to do anything, but it's fairly easy to send 1,000 of these requests, and now you've got 1,000 web server threads that are doing nothing, that each have their own stack and that are taking up precious memory. So you've essentially caused a denial of service in another different way against this host. And then of course there's different protocol specifiers: file, FTP, Gopher, Archie, whatever you want. You can specify these and have this OpenID enabled website possibly perform some sort of malicious operation. When we looked at OpenID libraries and OpenID code, we found that they usually only blocked 2 of these URLs. They blocked protocol specifiers other than HTTP and HTTPS, so the last attack wouldn't work. But they also blocked internal IPs like 192.168.1.15. But they didn't block you from port scanning. They didn't block you from contacting the loopback interface. They didn't block you from causing a denial of service. And that's one of the problems with URLs, is that they're so flexible. Who's to say you don't own NSA.gov? And I mean, who here doesn't? But it's very hard to say who owns what. So I guess the next observation, again, a common security mantra, is that flexibility and security don't get along. And it would be wise for people implementing OpenID-enabled websites to be less flexible and more paranoid and not accept the type of input that they're accepting right now. So after the information has been downloaded and the OpenID server and the OpenID username have been stripped out of that HTML page, the OpenID-enabled website contacts the identity provider directly to negotiate cryptographic keys. The reason cryptography is required is to protect request and response URLs. Other than this communication, the way the OpenID-enabled website and the identity provider talk is by putting information, is by redirecting the user and putting information in the redirect. So without cryptography, it would be very easy for a user to spoof credentials. He could go to jite.com, put in bill.gates.name as his OpenID. He'd be redirected to his identity provider, but instead of filling in the appropriate information, you could just spoof a fake URL back to the OpenID-enabled website that says, yeah, you passed authentication, because the only way these two websites are communicating is through the browser redirects. By negotiating cryptographic keys, the OpenID-enabled website is sure that the information actually came from the identity provider, because it can be encrypted or signed so that they know it only came from myopenid.com or whatever identity provider they're using, and they're not spoofing that information. So the way this exchange works is that a shared symmetric key is generated using Diffie-Hellman. As you can see in the slide, this is an example HTTP request that would occur in this situation. So jite.com is contacting myopenid.com. It's basically passing along all the variables that you need for a Diffie-Hellman exchange. And what's the first thing that you as a security professional think of when you think of Diffie-Hellman? Man-in-the-middle attacks, that's right. So Diffie-Hellman is vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. The OpenID specification actually suggests you run Diffie-Hellman over secure HTTP to improve protocol security. The problem is that then there's no reason to use Diffie-Hellman at all during the entire process. If you don't use secure HTTP, you're using Diffie-Hellman and it's vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. If you do use secure HTTP, you have a secure tunnel under a secure tunnel, which makes it redundant. You could just pass around binary strings for the shared symmetric key. So our third observation for OpenID implementers and OpenID implementations is that homebrewed crypto is a no-no. And then instead of rolling your own and trying to do things your way, you should just stick to secure solutions. OpenID implementations should definitely not try to think outside the box.
Okay, I'll take you through the second half. So the next thing is, so you logged into your OpenID site. The OpenID site fetched your URL, right? You fetched eugene.circulation.name. It found out who your identity provider is. It contacted the identity provider and established a secure link with it. The next thing that happens is that jai.com redirects us to myopenid.com for authentication. Okay, that's step number 4. Okay, so you've seen this is before. This is showing that eugene.circulation.name is associated with a particular identity provider. This identity provider is myopenid.com/server, meaning that when jai.com fetches this, it knows, okay, in order for Eugene to log in, Eugene needs to go to that URL and enter his credentials. And this is how it looks like. This is a standard HTTP redirect. All it says is, all it says to the browser is, go to this URL. And you notice that the URL itself, myopenid.com/server, is exactly the URL that you see on the screenshot above. So all jai.com does is it grabs the URL out, and it appends a bunch of parameters to the URL itself. So one of the things that appends is an association handle, and that's a cryptographic, it's basically an HMAC protecting the URL integrity. It provides the identity name, that is my URL, eugene.circulation.name, and it says return to this site, etc. So what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that jai.com is controlling who the user is going to be authenticated with, right? Imagine jai.com is a malicious site. You go to jai.com, you put in your URL, eugene.circulation.name. But what happens is instead of redirecting me to myopenid.com where I can put in my password, it directs me to myprecious.com. What you probably can't see on the slide is that in the URL, it's no longer myopenid.com, it's myprecious.com. What is myprecious.com? Well, it's a malicious site, right? It's a malicious site which looks identical to myopenid.com, right? You can't tell a difference between myprecious and myopenid, and that's the whole point. The user will not be able to tell, right? The majority of the users cannot even identify the address bar in their browser, let alone the URL that's in that address bar. So in this case, the user will come to myprecious.com, he discloses the password, he says sign in, the password is stolen, and the user is suddenly redirected back to where he was supposed to come, right? So there you go. The whole OpenID-based digital identity is stolen, and the user didn't even realize that there was an attack taking place. So that's called phishing, right? It's a very prevalent attack. And phishing is currently, I would say, number one enemy of the OpenID specification. It is the number one problem that's cited by various people. And it's unfortunately also the problem that has not been completely addressed. There's some talk about putting the security, some locking down just to prevent this problem into the browser itself, into Firefox 3, for example. However, that has not been implemented, and there are no other solutions on the table that can address this problem. So this is still very much outstanding and still very much a problem. Well, the other thing is you can phish not just with malicious OpenID servers, right? So you can go to jai.com, and even jai.com is not malicious, which it's not. You can still get owned. And the way this works is if your host provider, ug.circulation.name, is malicious, it can simply return the wrong OpenID.server information, right? In this case, whereas before my OpenID.server was my OpenID.com, in this case it's myprecious.com, right? When OpenID sites such as jai.com fetches this information, on bestowing it to the user and to itself, it will going to redirect the user to a malicious site, right? So if you want to attack and steal a bunch of passwords, all you have to do is find a host which hosts a lot of these OpenID URLs. So let's say you want to attack the .name TLD, which hosts, a few 100,000 users. right? You attack their servers, and then you modify the software to return, every time you return OpenID to that server, you replace it with their own URL. And this way you can, steal millions of accounts. So you don't necessarily have to hack Jai.com or any other site to attack it. You can just attack the host itself and carry out the same phishing attack. The principle is the same. You're redirecting the user to the wrong URL, or rather to the URL which does unspecified things. Okay, so our next advice to you is to change your bank password again. And the reason for that is we phished the first attempt. Okay, so the next observation is that phishers 1, OpenID 0. Like I said, phishing is a very serious threat to OpenID. There are currently no solutions on the table. Okay, we might see some in the future with Firefox and whatnot, but that's currently not the case. And as I mentioned before, we should not be relying on user education either. You cannot expect little Johnny to understand that myprecious.com is actually malicious and myopenid.com is not. So if you can't read that, that says Moses stop being a cunt. Okay. So next thing is, so you've redirected, you came from jai.com, you came to myopenid.com, right? So this is the screen which shows you, your password field and you're supposed to log in. So what happens? Well, if you remember, there's a little checkbox which says, keep me signed in. And that's very convenient because once you sign in to jai.com and then you go to another site, let's say bank.com, you're automatically logged in, right? This is very, very convenient. However, if you think about it the other way, what actually happens is that your identity provider, myopenid.com, sees and processes every single request, right? So you go to jai.com, MyOpenID sees this. You go to bank.com, it sees it again. You go to amazon.com, it sees it again. Okay? What does that mean? It means you have no privacy. Or rather, you're trusting your identity provider, in this case, myopenid.com, to not do anything with this information, right? So if I was to break into, let's say, myopenid.com, and myopenid.com hosts hundreds of thousands of users, I can simply track them across the internet without doing anything. Right? Because the users come to me. The users come to me and say, hey, I want to log into bank.com, or hey, I want to log into amazon.com. So I can track every single user, right? And so OpenID makes privacy difficult. I mean, to be honest with you, it's not just OpenID, right? It's any single sign-on system which aggregates this information will make it difficult. But in case of OpenID, you're actually sending that information onto some other third party, right? It's not something that's hosted in your machine. It's actually out on the internet, right? So you're sending off every single request to someone else. So, well, if you're paranoid, you might say, well, I'm just going to use a separate OpenID login for every site I use, right? Well, that's crazy. I mean, that's not single sign-on anymore. So that's one of the issues that we found is that, OpenID makes privacy difficult. So once you've entered your password, you then take it back to jai.com, right? So myopenid.com says, yep, this is eugene.circulation.name. He's been authenticated. He's good to go. Well, where am I going? Well, I'm going back to jai.com. How am I getting back to jai.com? Well, the same redirect that we saw before, right? The same attack where you're getting phished on your way from jai.com down to myopenid.com. You're getting phished the same way on the way back, right? So imagine I broke into myopenid.com now. And I want to monitor what you're doing. So on this particular location, right, you're seeing that OpenID returned to is jai.com, right? However, there's nothing that stops me from saying instead of going to jai.com, actually go to myprecious.com again, right? Then what myprecious.com does, it simply sits as a proxy between the user and everything else that the user is doing. So think about it this way. I'll give you a real example, right? You go to hotmail.com, right? If hotmail.com was integrated with OpenID, you go to Hotmail, you put in your URL, your OpenID, you log in. But instead of taking you back to Hotmail, I'm going to take you to mypreciousHotmail.com. And mypreciousHotmail.com is sitting there and acting as Hotmail. It's connecting to Hotmail on your behalf, giving you all the data. And it looks like you're actually working with Hotmail, but you're not, right? So every single email that you read, every single email that's sent out goes through me. So once again, I completely control what you're doing on the internet. And this is exactly the same problem, right? There is no difference, right? This is all about phishing. Every time there is a URL in place, every time I have to say, actually go to this URL or go to that URL, there's a problem. Because how do you know, right? How does the browser know that this is, where the user is supposed to go, right? The location is a location is a location, right? To browser, it's just a URL. It doesn't know whether it's supposed to go to jai.com or, or myprecious.com, right? To the browser, it all looks the same. It's only the user who can make the distinction. But the users are clueless, right? The users will disclose the information to anyone. So there's really no easy solution to phishing. So maybe, there might be some interesting solutions coming out in Firefox, but that's not out yet. So we are yet to see a decent solution to this. But that's not the only attack that happens, right? When you log into myopenid.com and you're ready to go back to jai.com, there's actually a much more serious attack, and that's called it's a replay attack. Because what happens is, like Vlad said, there's the only communication between the site you're logging into and the identity provider who controls you is through these redirects that are going back and forth, right? That is the only communication. So when you put in your password and myopenid.com says, yep, you're done, go back to where you came from, the only thing that happens is that the browser receives a redirect says, go back to where you came from. Okay? That's it. There's nothing else. So what happens is, if I sit on the wire, if I sniff this URL, and I then put it in my browser and I press enter, I just logged into that site as you. Because in effect, this URL itself is the proof that you've just logged in, right? Because that's the only thing that goes from your identity provider back to jai.com. So if I were to sniff this URL, I can log in as you, right? Because there's nothing else that's happening underneath. Everything you need to log into the site is right here in this URL. And if you can sniff this URL, you can log in as eugene.circulation.name into jai.com, right? So there was a suggestion to use nonces, right? And nonce, in America, to use number used once. It's a cryptographic technique. In England, I live in London, it means gay man. And here we're using it as a cryptographic technique, not a gay man. And nonce means number used once. Okay? So with a replay attack, the problem is that someone can reuse the URL more than once. So when you have a nonce, what happens is you use your URL, and that URL then becomes invalid. Because the next time when the attacker tries to replay this URL, the site will say, actually, I've already received this nonce. I've already seen this nonce once. And the second time, it rejects it. So in theory, the nonce solution solves this problem. However, first of all, nonce is actually not part of the specification, not part of the protocol. Okay? So your identity provider might actually not be supporting them, because there is nothing in the specification that says you must implement nonces to prevent this attack. Okay? If myopenid.com doesn't want to prevent this attack, it doesn't prevent it, right? So you're wide open. However, even the bigger problem is the fact that nonces don't actually protect against active attackers. Okay? What is an active attacker? Well, a passive attacker is usually someone who just sits on a wire and listens to all the traffic, right? So if I sit in a wire between myopenid.com and jai.com, I can just sniff all the traffic, and if I grab this URL, I can impersonate you. An active attacker is the same thing, except he or she cannot just sniff just the traffic, but they can also inject traffic, right? So they can send packets, they can do other things, right? And you might say, well, I'm protected against passive attackers, I'm happy with that. However, the fact that nonces are even discussed in the OpenID community means that the community recognizes that there is a threat. Okay? The community recognizes that it is possible for someone to sit on the wire between these two parties. Okay? But when you're able to sniff the wire, sending out a packet doesn't cost anything extra. Right? So the difference in our case between passive attacker and an active attacker is actually non-existent. Anyone who sits on the wire can perform an active attack. Okay? That means that if I'm an active attacker and I'm sniffing the wire, sitting between the two parties that you're talking to, all I have to do is, just as a passive attacker, sniff your URL, except now, instead of just, reusing it, I have to kill your connection, right? So the way this attack runs is, I sit on the wire, I sniff your URL, the moment I see it, I reset your connection and reuse that URL. So I'm the first one to use it because you actually didn't have a chance to complete your transaction, right? And how easy to do it? Well, it's trivial to do, because when you're sitting on the wire, you're seeing all the TCP traffic, right? So you're seeing all the sequence numbers. So killing someone's connection is sending out a single packet, unauthenticated, and the only thing you need to know to reset the connection is a sequence number. And the sequence number is right there in the packet that you just sniffed. So sitting there and not doing anything, and sitting there and resetting your connection, in terms of effort, is about 5 minutes of code, right? It is absolutely trivial. So what I'm saying is that even though people might say, well, this protects against active attackers, I'm saying this is not good enough. Because an active attacker and a passive attacker, the amount of effort between the two is it's not a serious amount of effort. So, a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but we're saying is that nonsense or nonsense, okay? And the reason for this, people might say, well, this will protect me against active attackers, that's good enough. Well, we're saying it's not good enough. Because anyone who can sniff the wire can do everything that we just discussed, right? So going from a passive attack to an active attack and bypassing nonsense is trivial and something that's not currently addressed by the OpenID spec. Okay. So you're logged in, right? I mean, you've been owned 5 or 6 times by the time you've logged in. However, you've logged in. And, what happens now? Are you secure once you're logged in? Well, I think you know the answer to that particular question. And you're not secure because there are other attacks that you can start carrying out once you've logged in with your OpenID. So let me show you an example. In this particular case, it's just a piece of HTML code, and it has an iframe. It's a hidden iframe, right? When you include that in the HTML code, the user will not be able to see anything on the screen. There's nothing on the screen. However, what this iframe is doing, it's connecting to your bank.com, and it's logging you in. Okay? Remember there was this little checkbox that says, keep me logged in? Well, imagine this iframe is integrated into cutekittens.com. Okay, you go to Cute Kittens, and you want to see all those pictures of cute kittens, right? But to see the pictures, you have to log in with the OpenID. So that's not a problem. I'll just log in with OpenID. So you quickly put in your OpenID URL, right, waiting to see cute kittens. You click, keep me logged in because, you can't be asked, and you log in. The next thing that happens, you see a picture of a very cute kitten or whatever. However, underneath, what you're not seeing is there's a hidden iframe sitting on that page. Okay, and assuming that you've selected this box that says, keep me logged in, this particular iframe will log you in automatically. Because what happened underneath, you contact your bank.com and saying, log in this user, this automatically goes back to your OpenID provider. OpenID provider says, hey, this guy wants to be logged in, so he logs you in. You're logged in. Okay, no harm done. You just logged into bank.com. Nothing has happened. However, once you logged in, you can start doing other things, right? Because once you logged in, you can transfer money out. So there you go. You're sitting, you're looking at your cute kittens while, all the money is coming into an attacker's account. So that's a cross-site request forgery. I mean, the cross-site part, it basically states that you're on one site, but you're being attacked on another site, right? So you're on cutekittens.com and you're getting owned on your bank.com domain, right? And this particular attack is not, it's not tied to OpenID, right? I mean, you can carry this out attack against other sites today, right? Like you can do other things. You can go to cutekittens.com and all of a sudden you just made a purchase on eBay. Right? This is not particular to OpenID. However, with OpenID, with this integration of the single sign-on integration where you can get logged in without actually realizing it, that's what makes things worse. Right? When I can log you in automatically into your bank.com site without you knowing, well, all of a sudden bad things can happen to you, right? And to your account balance. So that's the problem with cross-site. And so what we're saying is OpenID robs you of control, right? And when I say robs you of control, it means that when you use OpenID, you're effectively outsourcing part of your security policy. You're outsourcing your authentication part you're outsourcing your authentication to the OpenID identity provider, right? And it is then the identity provider, the myopenid.com, and not the relying party, not the bank.com that makes security decisions, right? So when you outsource your security policy, when you're no longer in control, there are interesting things that can happen to you. And there's a cute kitten robbing you. So, that's, oh yeah, another advice, you probably know this by now, you should change your bank password, or don't bother because we probably own you anyway. So everything we talked about so far has been negative, right? OpenID is broken here, OpenID is broken there, we own you here, we own you there, right? But is it really all that bad? Well, there's some good things about OpenID, not a lot of it, but there's some good things. So is it really all that bad? No, not really. We don't think it's all that bad. In fact, we think that there can be some very good things that come out of OpenID. In particular, we think that OpenID can make your logins far more secure than they are today. Okay, well, how? I mean, I just showed you 7 different ways to own OpenID. I mean, how are you going to make things better? Well, the thing about OpenID is that you have only one service, right? That's the whole premise of OpenID. You have single sign-on, right? You have one URL, and you have to log in once. Okay? And that's good. Because you have only one front door. You have only one front door to secure. Meaning that you can afford to use client-side certificates. You can afford to use two-factor authentication. You can afford to use markets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Why? Because you have to do it only once, okay? In a perfect world where, you only have OpenID, you secure one front gate and you're done. So you can afford to do it at the time. Because today, you cannot afford to do it, okay? Here's how it looks today, right? If you want to introduce two-factor authentication today, that's how it looks, right? You've got your Amazon secure ID, you've got your bank secure ID, you've got your PayPal, et cetera. You might think this is crazy, but it's not, because last month, PayPal announced that they're going to be sending a security token to all of their users. Okay? Obviously, PayPal has a lot at stake, right? There's a lot of money flowing around, so they can afford to do it, right? But what stops Expedia.com, right? Or, Dig, I don't know. Maybe Dig, goes all crazy about security and say, hey, we want to protect all the users using two-factor authentication. We're going to send them all a secure ID, right? Pretty soon, this is how it looks like, right? You want to log in, you have to open this big box and find your secure ID, right? And you're laughing, but it's actually true. I used to work in an investment bank, right? So there's a lot of money floating around there as well. And, what happens is, you want to trade with, Morgan Stanley, you want to trade with Goldman Sachs, you want to be on Bloomberg, right? So what happens is every one of those users, they send you a secure ID, right? Because they're like, we want to be secure, right? So we care about security, so we're going to send them a secure ID. And you know what happens? You know what happens with traders? Traders take the secure IDs, they write down their PIN on it, they stick it on the secure ID, they take the secure ID, they stick it on the monitor, right? And all of a sudden, we're secure. And here's a Morgan Stanley secure ID, here's Goldman Sachs, here's Bloomberg, right? Is it two-factor authentication? Yes. Is it really secure? No, I don't know. So what I'm saying is the current situation is just not viable, right? You just cannot afford, you just can't do it. And second of all, the cost, right? The cost of implementing secure ID for Dig or for Slashdot is just too high, right? You just cannot afford to do it. However, with the OpenID, when you have only one login to do it, right? You don't need a box of secure IDs. You can afford to do it, right? Because you can amortize the cost and the time of implementation across every single site. Right? When a single secure ID is protecting your PayPal, eBay, Amazon, Dig, Slashdot accounts, all of a sudden the cost is not all that high. Or if it is high, you're amortizing it across the whole internet. Right? All of a sudden, okay, that makes sense. Right? So you're not getting the same security benefits on Dig.com and Slash.com as you are on Expedia and PayPal, which is not bad. Right? It's good. So yeah, once you forget about privacy, right, there's some good things. So yeah, you got only one front door to secure. That's my car, and lessons learned, right? So we talked about a few attacks, and we talked about one benefit. So let me just quickly recap what we talked about. The first thing we talked about is that complexity breeds insecurity, right? The current situation is simply not sustainable, right? I don't know how many accounts I have. I play with WebTO a lot, so I sign up to a few sites per day, and I have hundreds. And it got to a point where I cannot remember my Expedia account, right? Expedia, I use something quite a bit because I travel a lot, but it got to the point where I have so many usernames and so many passwords, I can't even remember the username to the important sites, right? Like Expedia. And this is a real thing. I cannot remember, so I just keep trying different combinations. I keep trying, I keep logging myself out. Or locking myself out because I can't remember. So in the end, I have to change my username. I have to tell them to email me the new password, right? Because you know how you can log into a site and you stay logged in for a month or two, right? The worst thing that happened to me is I log in on a site and then I don't know, cookie gets deleted or something, I get logged out. That's like the worst thing because I have no idea what my username and password is. So I just panic. And, that's bad, right? And I'm paranoid, I'm a security expert or whatever, but even I have to end up using stupid schemes like our secure SSO of having one login and two passwords. One's insecure, one's secure, right? The worst thing that happens when, you go into dig.com and say, well, you need to use at least one letter in your password. So then you have one insecure password, one secure password, and one insecure password with the letter 2 in it. I'm sure you guys can come across this because I cannot be the only person who's feeling this pain. And the thing is, it's not going to get any better, right? The internet is not going anywhere anytime soon, I don't think. So the number of sites that we use on a daily basis is only going to increase, and the complexity is certainly not going away. Okay, so it's only going to get worse before it gets better. Okay, so next thing is we talked about flexibility and security, right? Okay, so OpenID, on one hand, solves a nice problem, right? It solves a real problem, And it solves the complexity by introducing this nice, easy-to-use OpenID mechanism. However, with OpenID, then, there's a whole raft of problems on their own that are specific to OpenID, and flexibility being one of them. When OpenID designed, right, it wasn't, the Brad Fitzpatrick didn't sit down there and say, hey, in a few years it's going to be used to secure Amazon.com and Bank.com. No. When it was designed, it was basically said, hey, I'm sick and tired of picking this new username and passwords for every single blog. So let me just throw something together, right? Here we are 3 years later, we're talking about securing Bank.com using this scheme, right? Something that is supposed to protect your comments on blogs, all of a sudden used for everything. So, when OpenID was designed, it was designed to be very flexible, right? Because this used to be a bunch of bloggers, right? Who cares about security? However, now that we actually do care about the security, things like flexibility are killing us, right? So the complexity is killing security, but flexibility is killing security just as much, right? Because who says NSA.gov port 20 or 21 is not my OpenID, right? No one can say it. So the next thing we talked about was the homebrewed cryptography. Right, and that's, if you've done anything with cryptography, you know about this, right? This is getting drummed into your head, should be getting drummed. If it's not getting drummed in your head, is that you should not be rolling your own. Ever, ever, ever. Right? Because there's always going to be smarter than you. Always. Who's going to be able to break your cryptography. Cryptography is so hard, you shouldn't even try it. Okay? OpenID has tried, has learned their lesson, and now they have a hack in place where it says, run Diffie-Hellman over SSO. What's the point, right? Then we talked about phishing, right? Phishing is a very serious threat today. If you're using OpenID today, the one thing you should be keeping in mind is the next time you log in, do check the URL. I hope you know where that is. It's that address bar on the top. Do check it because there is no solution today in place to prevent phishing. Very serious threat. And, we showed you 3 separate examples of how you can get phished. You can get phished because Jai.com is malicious. You can get phished because .name host is malicious. You can get phished because myopenid.com is malicious, right? Because all the stack, everything is targeted, everything is kind of, the user is always losing because no matter who gets compromised, the user gets owned. And there's so many different components, so many different moving parts. It's actually very feasible to carry out these attacks, right? This is not theoretical. This can be very, very practical and very easy to execute. The other thing we talked about is OpenID and privacy. Right. OpenID is great because it keeps you logged in everywhere, right? It's great. You go to jai.com, you go to cutekittens.com, you go to bank.com. It's so easy. It works perfectly. However, if you care about privacy, then you should realize that all of those logins are actually being tracked. And they're not tracked on purpose, right? I mean, well, they might be tracked on purpose, but still, you're putting this, you're trusting myopenid.com with your data. Because if myopenid.com is compromised, like I said, you simply sit there and you can monitor everyone's sessions, right? So if you have myopenid.com and I own it, I just sit there, I tail the log and I see you going to this site, to this site, to this site, this site, this site, right? And, this is done transparently. I don't even have to own you anymore. I don't have to hack your computer to find out where you're going. Because all I have to do is hack one central place, one central server, and all of a sudden, I'm just sitting there and watching everyone's activity on the net. A little bit scary. We talked about the replay attacks. On the way back when you go from from myopenid.com back to jai.com, if I can steal your URL and replay it, I can log in as you. Not a good thing. So we throw in some nonsense because I hopefully demonstrated they're not providing strong enough of a security guarantee to say that I cannot spoof you. So OpenID robs you of control, right? The problem with OpenID, and to be honest with you, probably why you will never ever be able to log into Expedia.com or Bank.com with OpenID is simply because with OpenID you're outsourcing your security policy, right? I don't know of a single bank that says, oh yeah, we'll just allow some random third party we don't even know to allow users to authenticate users on our behalf, right? This is simply not feasible. It is never going to happen. However, if it does happen, there are very good things they'll be driven by that. And as we talked about, there's only one front door to secure, right? So you can apply two-factor auth, smart cards, client-side SSO certificates, and whatever else you want to do to secure the communication. So, what are we saying? Are we saying the OpenID is doomed? Well, so it might sound like that's what we're saying. I guess that's not what we're trying to do, right? We do think the OpenID is a very great system. It solves a very real problem. I'm feeling the pain every day, and I cannot wait until more sites are using it. However, I think we've pointed out enough security and privacy concerns to be at least mildly concerned about what will happen if everyone starts using OpenID. So, with that, we encourage you to visit OpenID.net. OpenID.net is the main web page for the OpenID project. So OpenID.net contains all the specifications and all the other information that you might need if you're interested in it. The other thing is you can check out freeyourid.com. Freeyourid.com allows you to get a .name URL, which is OpenID integrated, which is eugene.circulation.name. So you go to freeyourid, you put in your name, and it gives you a URL. So in my case, it's eugene.circulation.name. So that URL you can then redirect to anywhere you want, but it also becomes your OpenID, right? And I hope you never forget your name. So in fact, you'll never be in a situation where you go to expedia.com and you cannot remember what happened, right? Unless you just came out of coma. So with .name, right, it's an interesting proposition because you get your name, which is OpenID integrated, you put that together and you have a very interesting system. So with that, we'll take any questions. Yep.
Looking at a website that has a couple tens of thousands of users, and there's been talk coming up to me about having us support OpenID, not letting people log into us with that, but instead people want to be able to claim that they own particular pages because it's got some social networking on it. So we're contemplating either doing it as a provider or simply allowing users to embed delegation information straight onto their page, which would be a very tight control of HTML. I was wondering what the trade-offs are, what particular risks we should worry about there.
When you act as a provider?
Well, I'm leaning more and more away from not acting as a provider because most of these users will have larger accounts or AOL and then they
Right. So the question was, we're running a site and we have, thousands of users and we're getting approached with requests to support OpenID. I think if you're saying you're not going to be providing the actual OpenID, I think the biggest threat is what I showed when you log into jai.com and you use then jai.com as your launch pad for attacks, right? So if your site is, site.com and you allow arbitrary URLs, the problem is today you're going to use one of the existing libraries to support that. Those existing libraries, such as Jan Rain, are, they don't protect against all the attacks that we described, right? So if you were to enable OpenID today, tomorrow I go home and I use your site to port scan NSA.gov.
No, not as a consumer.
I think
let's say I have mysite.com and Bob wants to say, I own the page, I have an account at mysite.com. So on some third-party site, who he wants to prove that to, he enters mysite.com/Bob.
Okay.
To prove to that site that he owns an account with us. That's the use case we're looking at.
Yeah, I guess that's a case where you're hosting a page, right?
Yes.
I mean, in that case, there isn't really there isn't a direct threat. There's I can't attack your site directly. The threat is you can potentially, if you become as big as Facebook, right, you'll become a very big target. Because if I can own you, I can not immediately, but I can then go on to own of your users. So there's a slight, you're slightly increasing your chance of being an attacker. But then if you become the size of a Facebook, you're becoming attractive for all the other reasons anyway. So it's not a massive concern, I would say. So if you want to be providing those URLs to your users, you should be okay because it's the other parties that are involved that are actually be carrying a lot of the risk. So that's actually quite a low-risk activity.
Cool. They'll be happy to see that.
Yeah, but if you give me a few days, I might come up with something interesting. So, yeah.
Is there PII, personally identifying information stored at the provider that gets transmitted back and forth to the line party?
So the question was, is there any personally identifiable information that's stored on the host? And there doesn't have to be. So you can go into myopenid.com today and register an arbitrary URL that has no real data. It's just a URL, right? It's just a URL that says I am johnny.myopenid.com. That's the only information about it. However, if you want to make this a little bit more useful, of course, and make your life easier, you can associate other information with that URL. So you can say, here's my full name, here's my address, here's my phone number. And the next time you go onto a site and say, I'm going to register, you can say, actually, I want to give all this information to that site as a registration. I don't want to re-enter it, right? So it's quite convenient in that case. But it is of concern if you have a lot of information associated with the account. But I believe that that before that information is given to the provider, you're always asked. Okay, the OpenID provider will ask you, are you sure you want to disclose your address and your email to this party? So you won't just give it away. So that OpenID verification page that you had will tell you, you're about to disclose this, this, and this to this host. Do you want to allow it or deny it? So you can't easily say, I'm just going to steal all this user information. So there. Are
providers vetted in any way as part of the project for security?
No. It's all about trust. The OpenID providers are not vetted in any way, and you simply have to trust them. In fact, there are OpenID providers which are all they do is they accept URLs and they automatically authenticate. Right? There are providers that don't even ask for passwords. This whole New York Times thing. You have to go to New York Times, you want to read an article, and they ask you for a password, and you wonder why. Well, if they were to support my OpenID, you can use the special OpenID providers who don't actually provide any authentication, right? It's a throwaway provider. So you go to New York Times, it asks you for your OpenID, you say throwawayprovider.com, you press sign in, it immediately takes you back. It doesn't even ask you. So the OpenID provider, A, is not vetted by the community, and B, can do anything it wants, right? So it doesn't actually have to provide any authentication at all, right? It can just immediately pass it through. But there is no official OpenID provider that can provide the security guarantees. There are a few players that are coming out that are building up this trust with the community, but once again, they're just independent entities. Yeah.
For the New York Times case, you're saying you could have OpenID providers, cypherpunks.net, and just log in.
Yeah. Yeah. So bugmenot.com today basically has all the passwords. It's a bugmenot OpenID equivalent. But at the same time, you can have, like I talked about, the secure ID enabled. So you can have an OpenID provider which you go to, and it requires a client-side certificate backed by secure ID, as long as you have a smart card on your computer as well, right? So it's really it's dependent on. It's up to the provider to provide as little or as much security as they want. So, anything else? Nope. In that case, thank you very much.
Thank you.